What we are seeing in these drone strikes is not just a tactical battlefield update, but a strategic signal. Ukraine's reported use of long-range drones to hit Russian oil refineries reaches far beyond the immediate explosions or the footage circulating online. Energy infrastructure sits at the center of Russia's economic resilience and its capacity to sustain a prolonged war, and targeting it reframes the conflict from one of front line advances to one of systemic pressure on the Russian state. Russia's energy infrastructure occupies a uniquely powerful position in the country's political economy, and that is precisely why it has become such a consequential target. Oil refining is not an abstract industrial process in Russia. It is the mechanism through which raw resources are converted into exportable value domestic fuel and, critically, state revenue. The Russian federal budget relies heavily on income from oil and gas, and while crude exports often dominate the headlines, refineries are the nodes that keep this system flexible and profitable. When refineries are damaged or forced offline, the state's ability to monetize its resources is constrained in ways that go far beyond a single facility or region. Refineries are also complex, high-maintenance installations that do not lend themselves to quick fixes. They require specialized components, trained personnel, and constant calibration to operate safely and efficiently. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Western sanctions have restricted Russia's access to advanced refining technology, replacement parts, and technical services. This means that even limited physical damage can lead to prolonged outages. A drone strike that disables a key processing unit can ripple through supply chains, reducing output for weeks or months rather than days. In that sense, the strategic value of targeting refineries lies not just in the initial impact, but in the lingering operational paralysis that follows. Beyond revenue generation, refined fuel is essential for Russia's military logistics. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and naval vessels all depend on steady supplies of diesel, jet fuel, and other petroleum products. While Russia maintains stockpiles, sustained disruption to refining capacity complicates the replenishment of those reserves. The military may be forced to prioritize certain regions or units, introducing inefficiencies and vulnerabilities into its operations. Energy infrastructure, therefore, sits at the intersection of economic strength and military capability, making it an unusually high-leverage target. There is also a domestic political dimension to refinery strikes. Energy stability has long been part of the implicit social contract between the Russian state and its population. Affordable fuel and uninterrupted supply help sustain public acquiescence, particularly in regions far from Moscow. Disruptions, price increases, or shortages undermine that sense of normalcy. Even if the Kremlin downplays the damage, the practical effects can be felt by industries, local governments, and consumers, gradually eroding the narrative that the war is distant and manageable. The strategic message embedded in strikes on Russian refineries is as important as the physical damage itself. For decades, Russian security planning rested on the assumption that the country's vast geography provided a natural buffer against direct attack. Critical infrastructure located hundreds of kilometers from any active battlefield was considered effectively untouchable. By demonstrating the capacity to reach deep into Russian territory, these drone strikes puncture that long-standing assumption and replace it with uncertainty, forcing a reassessment of what is truly secure. From the Kremlin's perspective, this creates an immediate dilemma. Air defense systems, electronic warfare units, and surveillance assets are finite resources. Every refinery, fuel depot, or energy hub that now requires protection is one less system available to shield military units, occupied territories, or major cities. Ukraine does not need to destroy the entire energy network to achieve this effect. It only needs to make the threat credible and persistent. The mere possibility of future strikes compels Russian planners to spread defenses thinner, increasing the likelihood of failure elsewhere. There is also a psychological dimension to this message, particularly for Russian political elites and regional authorities. Infrastructure deep inside Russia has symbolic value as well as practical importance. It represents the state's promise of control and invulnerability. When those sites are hit, even intermittently, it challenges the narrative that the war is contained and distant. Governors, industrial managers, and security officials are suddenly accountable for events they were never meant to confront, and that internal pressure travels upward through the system. Internationally, the message is equally pointed. These strikes signal that Ukraine is not confined to a passive, purely defensive posture. Instead, it is demonstrating agency and adaptability, showing allies and adversaries alike that it can impose costs on a stronger opponent despite constraints on conventional weaponry. This has implications for how foreign governments assess escalation dynamics, deterrence, and the long-term sustainability of Russian power under continued pressure. Finally, the message to Moscow is about time. Refineries are not easily relocated, and energy networks are inherently fixed targets. Each successful strike reinforces the idea that Russia's depth no longer guarantees strategic patience. The war is no longer only about advances and retreats along a front line. It is about whether the Russian state can protect the systems that underpin its economy and authority while continuing to wage war. The economic ripple effects of refinery strikes inside Russia unfold in layers, beginning with fuel supply disruptions and extending outward into prices, production, and public confidence. Refineries serve as balancing mechanisms in the energy economy, converting crude oil into usable products for both domestic consumption and export. When that process is interrupted, even temporarily, the imbalance can surface quickly. Fuel that would normally circulate within regional markets becomes scarce, logistics schedules are disrupted, and transportation costs rise. These pressures are often felt first at the local level, where industries and consumers experience shortages or sudden price increases. Fuel price volatility carries particular sensitivity in Russia. Energy affordability is woven into daily life, from commuting and agriculture to heating and industrial manufacturing. When refinery output declines, the government may attempt to cap prices or redirect supplies, but those interventions come at a fiscal cost. Subsidies must be expanded, emergency reserves drawn down, or exports reduced to stabilize domestic markets. Each of these choices weakens revenue streams at a moment when the state is already under financial strain from war expenditures and sanctions. Industrial sectors are especially vulnerable to these disruptions. Manufacturing, mining, and construction rely on predictable fuel availability to maintain output. When supplies tighten or prices fluctuate, companies are forced to scale back operations, delay projects, or pass costs on to consumers. Over time, this slows economic growth and reduces tax receipts for regional and federal governments. The effects compound quietly, often without dramatic headlines, but they accumulate in ways that are difficult to reverse. There is also an inflationary dimension. Higher fuel costs cascade through the economy, increasing the price of food, goods, and services. Inflation erodes purchasing power, which in turn affects public sentiment. In a political system that emphasizes stability and normalcy, even modest economic discomfort can have outsized significance. People may not connect a refinery strike directly to rising prices at the pump or in the grocery store, but they feel the consequences in their daily lives. Finally, these economic ripples complicate the Kremlin's broader messaging. Official narratives often stress resilience and self-sufficiency in the face of external pressure. Persistent disruptions to energy infrastructure undermine that message by revealing structural vulnerabilities. Each refinery forced offline becomes a reminder that the war's costs are not confined to distant battlefields, but are increasingly embedded in the domestic economy, touching regions and populations that were never meant to feel its impact so directly. Ukraine's expanding use of long-range drones against strategic targets reflects a deliberate evolution in how it approaches a war defined by asymmetry. Facing a larger adversary with deeper reserves of manpower, armor, and artillery, Ukraine has increasingly focused on methods that maximize impact while minimizing cost and risk. Drones fit squarely into that logic. They are comparatively inexpensive, can be produced or adapted domestically, and do not require pilots whose loss would carry political and human consequences. This makes them ideal tools for sustaining pressure over time rather than delivering a single decisive blow. What is particularly notable is how these strikes shift the locus of the conflict. Rather than concentrating solely on contested territory along the front lines, Ukraine is targeting systems that enable Russia to wage war at scale. This approach reframes success not as territorial gain alone, but as the gradual degradation of Russia's capacity to sustain operations. By forcing Russia to spend more on air defenses, repairs, and internal security, Ukraine imposes costs that accumulate steadily, even if they are not immediately visible on a battlefield map. The use of drones also reflects Ukraine's adaptation to constraints in Western military support. Advanced missiles and aircraft come with political conditions, limited quantities, and long delivery timelines. Drones, by contrast, offer flexibility and deniability. Their range and payload can be adjusted, their deployment can be calibrated to avoid certain thresholds of escalation, and their loss does not carry the same strategic weight as the downing of a manned aircraft. This allows Ukraine to innovate tactically while remaining within the bounds of what its allies are willing to support. There is an intelligence and coordination dimension as well. Successful long-range strikes require accurate targeting, surveillance, and timing. That implies an increasingly sophisticated integration of intelligence gathering, both domestic and shared, with operational planning. The ability to identify vulnerable nodes in Russia's energy network and exploit them selectively suggests a maturing war effort that is learning where pressure is most effective. At a broader level, this strategy underscores a shift toward endurance warfare. Ukraine is signaling that it does not need to overwhelm Russia militarily in a single campaign. Instead, it aims to persist, adapt, and erode using tools that are sustainable over the long term and that steadily narrow Russia's margin for maneuver. The broader implications of strikes on Russia's energy network extend well beyond the immediate participants in the war, touching international markets, alliance politics, and the evolving norms of modern conflict. Energy infrastructure has traditionally occupied a sensitive space in warfare, often avoided or treated with caution because of its civilian and global economic importance. By bringing refineries into the operational picture, the conflict signals a shift toward a more expansive definition of legitimate targets, one that blurs the line between military capability and economic system. For global energy markets, even limited disruptions inside a major producer like Russia introduce uncertainty. Traders, insurers, and governments respond not only to actual losses of output, but to perceived risk. Insurance premiums rise, shipping routes are reconsidered, and prices can fluctuate on the anticipation of further strikes. This means that the impact of a single drone attack can be amplified far beyond the damaged facility, influencing fuel costs and inflation in countries far removed from the battlefield. Diplomatically, these developments force Ukraine's partners into careful calibration. Allies must weigh their support for Ukraine's right to self-defense against concerns about escalation and precedent. Strikes on deep, economically vital infrastructure invite scrutiny over where red lines lie and how far the conflict might spread. At the same time, Ukraine's demonstrated capability strengthens its position in diplomatic negotiations, reinforcing the argument that continued support can yield tangible strategic effects. The strikes also shape how states think about vulnerability in an era of inexpensive, long-range technology. Drones have lowered the barrier to entry for attacking fixed infrastructure, raising questions about the security of refineries, power plants, and transport hubs worldwide. What is being tested in Ukraine and Russia is not just a bilateral conflict, but a model of future warfare in which economic nodes become prime targets precisely because they are difficult to defend completely. Finally, these implications reach into the question of war termination and endurance. Pressure on energy systems affects not only a state's finances, but its political resilience. Governments can absorb battlefield losses for long periods, but sustained economic stress narrows policy options and increases internal friction. In that sense, the targeting of energy infrastructure reshapes the strategic calculus of how wars are fought, sustained, and eventually brought to an end. Taken together, these developments point to a war that is increasingly defined by pressure on systems rather than movement of lines on a map. Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian refineries illustrate how modern conflict leverages precision, distance, and economic vulnerability to compensate for asymmetries in size and firepower. Energy infrastructure, once assumed to be safely removed from the battlefield, has emerged as a central arena where military capability, economic resilience, and political stability intersect. What makes this shift consequential is not simply the physical damage inflicted, but the cumulative strain it imposes over time. Each disrupted refinery forces difficult trade-offs inside Russia, from relocating air defenses to absorbing economic shocks and managing public expectations. At the same time, these strikes reinforce Ukraine's strategic narrative that it can adapt, innovate, and impose meaningful costs despite constraints, reshaping how endurance and leverage are measured in a prolonged war. The broader lesson extends beyond Ukraine and Russia. The conflict is demonstrating how vulnerable interconnected economic systems are to relatively low-cost, high-impact technologies, and how those vulnerabilities can alter diplomatic calculations, alliance dynamics, and global markets. As the war continues, the question is not only how long each side can sustain military operations, but how effectively they can protect the economic foundations that make those operations possible.